for this second session of the Hemispheric Security Conference. This is day 2. We've already had 3 fantastic panels, but I have a good feeling this is going to be our best today. Without much further ado, I wanted to turn it over to our moderator for this session, Dr. Cristina Rodriguez-Acosta. She is Assistant Director for Institutional Relations at the Jack D. Gordon Institute of Public Policy and has been with FIU for over 20 years, supporting our efforts in the region to support our partners in capacity building efforts. Dr. Cristina Rodriguez-Acosta, I turn it to you.
This session, we're going to talk about women in peace and security, and our conversation will be with Ambassador Jean Maines. And it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to have an hour to talk about the importance of women in peace and security and what is the U.S. doing and what is the region doing in these topics. So the way we're going to go about this session, I'm going to introduce the ambassador, and then she will make some preliminary remarks. And then we'll have some questions and comments that I have for her, and then we'll open for questions and comments from the audience. One note of housekeeping, as you probably know by now, if you've been attending our sessions, you have to send your questions through the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be able to see those questions and passing them along to the ambassador. So without further ado, I will introduce Ambassador Jean Maines. She's the civilian deputy to the commander and foreign policy advisor at the U.S. Southern Command. She's a former ambassador to the Republic of El Salvador. Ambassador Maines has been with the Senior Foreign Service at the Department of State since 1992 and has served under 4 presidents. Ambassador Maines has served as the Principal Deputy Coordinator for the Bureau of International Information Programs. Ambassador Maines has also served as Director of Resources for the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy. Overseas, Ambassador Maines has served in Afghanistan, in Portugal, in Syria, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. Ambassador Maines holds a master's degree in international administration from American University, and her bachelor's degree is from Liberty University in foreign policy. Ambassador, it's a real pleasure to have you join us this afternoon. I look forward to our conversation, and now you have the floor open for you for your preliminary remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cristina, and really a special welcome to everybody that's joining, listening in from around the hemisphere, and a special thanks to our hosts, to Florida International University. So to President Rosenberg, Dr. Mora, Brian Fonseca, Randy, the whole team, it's really remarkable the commitment that Florida International University has with the entire hemisphere. And for the U.S. Southern Command, we have a very good relationship with FIU and cooperate on a number of things. And then on a personal level, it's an honor to be here because our oldest daughter is a graduate of FIU about 1.5 years ago in communications. And so it's always terrific to be with the FIU team. And then bienvenidos a todos quienes están escuchando alrededor de la región en español y también en portugués. So it's great to have all of our Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers joining with us as well. So we're going to talk a few minutes about women, peace, and security, and then I really look forward to talking with Cristina about this and then getting your questions. When we talk about women, peace, and security, I often am puzzled a little bit by it because, in fact, there's no lasting peace without women, and there's no lasting security without women. And so when you think about women, peace, and security, if women are not a fundamental part of peace, of any peace process, negotiations, if they're not a fundamental part of security, there is no lasting peace and security. And so when we think about it, women are just fundamental to the process. If you're listening to this broadcast, there are some fundamental facts that I think we all share. Obviously, women make up 50% of the population. We also are trained from early age to be negotiators. We know how to listen, to develop those skills that you need to be able to include other perspectives, to come to mediation, to negotiate lasting peace and change. We're trained from that from an early age. And we need to be involved in every part of the process. Women have to be involved in every part of the economic process, in every part of the political process, in every part of the military process. And so I think what you're seeing now, both in the United States and around the region, is a recognition of basic facts. And then what do you do with those? So the United States, we're still making progress. We haven't solved this issue either. And so it's an issue we share with the region. But when we talk with our ministers of defense and the chiefs of defense from countries in the region, our key partners, all of them want to be successful. They want to be a successful minister of defense, chief of defense, police chief. They all want to do that. They can't do that if women aren't included. And so having women make up the police force, having women make up the military, and now at this point, it's not a matter of we're going to include women because it's the right thing to do, and it is the right thing to do. But they're going to include women because they want to be a success, because they want their country more secure. And so at U.S. Southern Command, what's happened over the last year, and when I came into this job, Admiral Fowler, who was the commander of U.S. Southern Command, and hopefully some of you listening were also on the session yesterday with him, he wanted to raise the profile of women, peace, and security. So we had a gender advisor, but it was part of an office. And so he really wanted to put it at the top. And so in our command, we have 2 deputies. We have 1 civilian, which is myself, and we have 1 military commander. And so he put women, peace, and security right at the top under my portfolio. What that means is every senior discussion, every international visit that we do to one of your countries, and we meet with your chief of defense, your minister of defense, we raise the issue of women, peace, and security. And how does that play out? So it plays out differently in each country. So for example, on a recent trip to Colombia, we brought together 50 women who were in the Colombian army. And I'll be honest with you, it was a 2-day trip, and it was the end of the 2nd day. And we were outside of Bogota, and it was hot. And we got to the end of the day, headed into the Women, Peace, and Security event with 50 women in the Colombian Army. And some actually wanted to cancel the meeting. They're like, we're running late, the schedule doesn't permit it. And we were just, no, we need this meeting. These women matter. They're important. And so we walked in the room with, a few people skeptical. And then one by one, the Colombian women started to tell their stories. They told their stories about how they decided to serve their country, why they decided to serve their country, what it meant to them, what it meant to their families. And the room was electric. So all that skepticism turned into energy. And at one point I looked at my watch, and we were well over the time period. And I turned to my Colombian partner. I said, well, maybe we should take the final 2 questions. And he was like, oh, no, we want to stay. And so you had gone from being a skeptic of why we're even doing this to the chief of the Colombian army saying, I didn't even know we had this much talent. We had never met these women. So I say that because many of us who are listening work on structural reform. And structural reform is critical. Structural reform about how you recruit, about how you promote, about how decisions are made and who's involved in the process. But there's also another component, which is highlighting individual success. And so highlighting women. So on every international trip, we highlight women who are really breaking barriers. And we highlight them because it sends a sign. It sends a sign that we prioritize women and women, peace, and security. It also says, we see you. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes it is about making visible the invisible. So sometimes it's about making visible the invisible. So those 50 women would really never have had contact with their senior leadership of the Army. And now they're visible. Their stories are heard. They're known. And so part of using a position like this one as the civilian deputy to the commander at U.S. Southern Command is making visible what women are achieving in the United States and around the region, and using the power of this position to do that. And then it's also about highlighting ministers of defense who are leading the way. So ministers of defense who are making the structural changes, the changes that last, the changes to make sure at every level you've addressed the cultural issues, the structural issues. Sometimes it's simple things to make sure you have separate sleeping facilities for women or separate bathrooms for women. And sometimes it's much more sophisticated changes. And then showing other ministers of defense in the hemisphere, hey, look at what the chief of defense in Jamaica is doing. He's knocking it out of the park. And that's important because that chief of defense in Jamaica, Rocky Mead, he really is doing that. He's doing the structural and the visible. And in doing that, he is making his society more secure. How can you have a security force or a police force that does not have women at its core? From a public perspective, the public also views women as more trustworthy. So in terms of countries that have significant issues with corruption, the public views women as more trustworthy, that they're not going to be corrupted. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was in El Salvador, we were meeting with a vetted unit that was working on money laundering. And they were working on money laundering related to some of the most serious criminals of one of the top gangs. I walk into that vetted unit expecting to see, I don't know what I expected to see, really, honestly. But I walked in that room and there were 7 women. 7 women, all about 5'1", 5'2", petite, taking on the most powerful members of one of the most violent gangs in the world. And when you think about that, you think, why do you do that? They care about their country. They care about their families. And so for me, you see that and it's inspiring. It inspires us to do more. And so those women go home to their houses. They didn't have a security team. They go home and live in neighborhoods without protection, but they do it. And so for a country like the United States, when we look at who you support, part of our job is giving the support for women, for men who are willing to take those risks for their countries, to make their countries more secure. And so you have to have the combination of investing in an institution and the long-term changes, but also lifting up those women who are making strides so that you can showcase the talent and make the visible what was once invisible. So with that, Cristina, I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll get into a lively question and answer period.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. I think they are really inspiring. And I think you have touched in many important issues. As you know, the United Nations this year will be the 20th anniversary of the United Nations resolution that calls for more involvement of women in politics, in policies, in processes. And the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 also talks about gender and how do we protect the rights of women and girls to more secure world, because at the end of the day, it's women and men working together that will, enhance security and make us safer. But I think you have touched on 2 very important points. One has to do, as you mentioned, with the structural reforms and how important it is to not only get the structural reforms going, but institutionalizing those reforms as well in our countries. But at the same time, I really like your story about the individual and how important it is to make the invisible visible. I happen to, as Randy mentioned, I have worked at FIU for now 25 years. And I come from the public policy and the public administration realm. And we're always thinking, how do we make sure that things work for citizens? And as you said, the 7 women in the meeting in El Salvador, when their work day is over, they go home. They're a citizen. They are part of their community. So I think it's important to realize that we're all, at the end of the day, we're all citizens and we're all in this together. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about, as you have mentioned, the importance of WPS, and I would like to understand more, maybe the audience wants to know more, but what is it that the US is doing? I know the US government, we have a plan of action. There's a law that was signed, I believe, in 2017. So maybe talk a little bit more about what are the US policies in this regard, both at home and supporting our regional allies in the region. You mentioned the case of Jamaica, Colombia, but maybe talk a little bit more about specific actions that that you are overseeing or helping promote.
So when you look at the United States as a whole, there's a lot that's happening, but as you referenced, the law is from 2017. The actual implementation language and strategy is from June 2019. So if you think about that, it's less than a year. That doesn't mean that work hasn't been happening. So let's be clear, people have been making progress across the region. Many of the militaries across the region have had incorporated women in different roles well before the US, frankly, and we're more advanced than the United States in many regards in early recruitment of women for combat roles. And so as you look as the military as an institution, it is about looking at every layer. So I mention that because one of the challenges that we're going through, I think both in the United States, and we're starting to recognize and get good data, but also around the region, is the importance of data. So there's no success, or it's impossible to measure success if you don't know where you are currently. And so that depends on data. So when I came into this job, we were looking and I was asking a lot of questions about, okay, where is each country in the hemisphere? Where is Argentina? Where is Brazil? Where is Chile? Where is Jamaica? And the availability of good data down to how are women progressing in different parts of the armed forces? How are women progressing in public security positions? But then expand that out to look at prosecutors in the Attorney General office or some other layer that impacts public security. And right now, from my viewpoint, we don't have the data that we need to know if we're going to be successful or even know how to measure success. So I think, somebody who's made big strides on that is in fact the Chief of Defense in Jamaica, and looking at every training program. And for him, he shared this story of, he wanted me to know that his top 5 recruits from his last intake of officers were women. And he's very proud of that. And I think when you look at somebody who's going structurally at every level, where are women? And then once you get past a certain level, are women getting to the senior leader decision-making jobs? In the US, we still have work to do. There's no doubt about it. And you can see that when you see a photo of the top leadership of the United States in the military. Where are the women? And so then you have to drill down and say, what are the specific things that prevent women from getting to that next level? Are they not in the right training or getting the right assignments, or what is happening? And so for me, it's about getting good data and knowing where you want to go and then targeting how to get there. And then the way you get movement is you highlight the personal stories. So for me, the personal stories in some ways give the motivation or the energy to keep doing the hard work of changing an institution.
Thank you. Yeah, I think data is important because, as you said, we need a baseline to know where we are and where do we want to get to, right? But I also want to emphasize something that I think you mentioned, and it's very important, at least I think to me and to many people listening to us, is the fact that, as you say, sometimes women, we start seeing more women in forces, be it the police or the armed forces, and even in government. But as you mentioned, it seems like they reach one, a certain level, and then what is it that is not happening? So I would like to kind of pick your brain and what do you think are some of those structural or maybe cultural things that keep women or the perception of women? Because as you say, sometimes when women do reach those positions of power, people say, oh, wow, they are good leaders. They know what they're doing. Oh, look at that. They can think outside of the box. Oh, look, they came out with the collaborative solution. So maybe, what is it? I think, I'm from Argentina originally. And sometimes the most simplistic explanation is say, well, we're just machistas in Latin America. It's going to be like that forever. And I don't think that's the reason. I think we need to think beyond just that simple explanation. And maybe if you can tell us a little bit of what you think are some of the reasons and how you think we can overcome some of those reasons.
So when you look at how senior job decisions are made, and I think, this applies whether it's in the diplomatic world, which is where I come from, or whether it's in the military world, when you get to that senior decision level position, the process in some ways is less objective and more subjective. So getting that next level is more dependent on your connections, who you know, your networking, and because at some point everybody's got the same level of training to get from here to here. Everybody's got a similar level of experience if you've had to have checked all these boxes to get to this. But then how you get from this to this, that one level up, comes down to a lot of subjectivity. And I think even in my own experience sitting on those types of panels, I had to catch myself when I looked at those decisions and we were comparing candidates. I remember one, and I'll be honest about it, we were looking for a senior position and I had two portfolios, one man, one woman. And I said, well, has she done this before, this type of senior job? And in that moment, I stopped back and I said, I didn't ask that question of him. And so even for somebody who's in one of the senior leader jobs, you have to guard against yourself doing it. So for a woman, you had to have the proven experience that you have already operated at that level. And for the male candidate, I assumed that because of their previous experience, that they could operate at that next level. And so it's a difference, but it's those small differences that sometimes make the difference in who gets appointed to the very senior policy jobs. And so I think for all of us, it's important to think about, again, what skills do you want in the job? And then what each candidate brings, but then be sure we're really looking at the candidate and not prejudging a candidate based on whether we think she could be strong enough, or she's tough enough, or she's decisive enough, or those kinds of things that often come into play when you talk about sometimes male and female candidates. So I think it is that criteria that when you get to the most senior jobs, there enters a lot more subjectivity than objectivity in those decisions.
Thank you. And that kind of relates to one of the, as you probably can see, there are a lot of questions coming up. But one question in particular, I think, ties up to what you just said, and it has to do with the indicators. What would be the key indicators that we can measure, that would help us measure the success of women in security forces? And I would like to tie that to also the question that I had before, that has to do with, in what way do we think that having more, of course we know that increase more women in peace and security will help national security, but if you talk, if you could talk a little bit more, what is that link, that link that goes through indicators, more women, and increased national security?
So I think, one of the ways to look at that is down to the community level. So in many countries, there are police that work at the community, municipality level. And so when I was working in El Salvador, we had a pretty in-depth security plan that targeted the 50 worst municipalities. It was El Salvador's plan and the US supported it. And a lot of it had to do with going down to the municipal level of security. And that's where you started to see when you had municipal level security with women involved, they tended to be more successful because you had a lot of negotiation that had to happen at the community level between the police, local businesses, the mayor's office, all of those things. And so we started to measure and insist, based on those measurements, that women were included as part of those local community group discussions because we found that they produced more, more inclusion of voices, which meant that there was more commitment for the long term for people to implement public security. And so I think that's an important one, is that as you have successes in a community where women have played a significant role, that again, you highlight that you highlight, we have more security and it is more long lasting, more sustainable because the process has been inclusive. And inclusive does mean that there are women both involved and leading processes.
Yeah, I think that, that is very, very important, that women are involved, not only as a token, we have X amount of women included in the policymaking process, but that they are a key component and decision makers in that process. I have the privilege of have worked a lot with municipal governments in Latin America, and sometimes talking to mayors or talking to local authorities, they will themselves tell once we have women involved in the decision-making process and in overseeing how those processes were implemented, they were more successful. I think those are very, very important points that we need to keep in mind. I would like to go to some of the questions that we have on the Q&A. Besides, noting that you're very popular in El Salvador, everybody is sending regards and how privileged they were to have you there, and I can see why. I think I'm going to go to some of the questions. There is the connection of civil society. There's a question there, but what is your experience in working with the nonprofit sector and with civil society? And in what way can we support civil society involved in issues of women in peace and security? And what's your experience and what do you think can be done to support them?
Again, just like in the US, a lot of security and a lot of development comes down to the local level. And so for in the US at the state level, in other countries at the municipal level. And so getting women involved at the municipal level, both on the political side, so in terms of looking at how are we encouraging women to participate politically, on the economic side, and then on the police military side. In working with NGOs and civic organizations, they're always critical to the process. And also they have usually, in most countries where they've been doing civil society development programming, they have the trust of the population. So in some ways, when you're looking at citizen security or public security, having NGOs and civic organizations at the table makes the most sense. Usually they have the most knowledge, they have the most contact, but they also have that key ingredient, which is trust. They have the trust of the population because they've been on the ground and they've been committed and consistent. And so for the United States, when we go in and work, whether it's in Guatemala, whether it's Honduras, whether it's El Salvador, y un saludo especial a todos los salvadoreños que están escuchando, when we have sort of that outreach, we really rely on the NGOs, the civic organizations, the community organizers, and the citizens themselves to be able to form those community groups on the ground so that you get the best information, because that's really where you make a difference. And again, when you look at women changing security, particularly when you look at violent crime. So a lot of people won't report violent crime, particularly domestic violence, which is significant in this hemisphere. But they will report it to a woman. And so having also women in key components, again, it's a trust issue. And it's the fact that a woman feels heard, they think their crime will be registered, and then it's recognized as a crime. And so I think when you get into public security, having NGOs, having civic organizations who have the trust, having women as an integral part plays a big role. And I'll give you, an example. We are working on reopening a public park, a giant public park, and coming up with a new police force that was less intimidating. So instead of the police walking around, with a machine gun, you had a police walking around with something less threatening to send off the message that this is a safe place. And we want you and your families to come here as a safe place. We had security cameras, the Salvadorans had security cameras up all over. So we started analyzing the data to see what was happening. And the people in the park, almost, I would say it was upwards of 85%, when they had a question, they went to the female police officer in the park. And, that's just interesting to think about because, and that was male, female, that was not just females. When they had a question, they walked up to the female police officer in the park. And why is that? It's because in general, in the population, females are viewed more trustworthy, more, you're going to give an answer to a question, you're not going to harass anybody. And so in terms of lifting up publicly the image of an institution, one of the biggest investments a police chief can make is incorporating more women at every level in their police force. And so, but that combination of civil society, the police at the local level is, frankly, in some ways much more powerful than at the national level. And that's really where change happens, where you see communities come together, you see security improve, and you see that resiliency that in so many ways women bring at home to our families and also to the workplace.
Thank you. I think that it's a very important question to that answer, and I think it ties to some of the comments and questions that are there. You talk about the violence against women and how violent is the hemisphere is against women, and I think that the earlier panel today also talked. Some of the speakers talked about violence against women and how the lockdown has kind of triggered even more or put on the alert this problem. So one of the questions that we have in the chat in the group is, what is your recommendation? As we go about reopening the countries and the impact that it might have on reopening. What can we do? This connection between civil society, local authorities, and protecting women. What do you think could be done in that regard?
Well, there's no doubt it's a really complicated moment for the United States. It's a complicated moment for the whole hemisphere and around the world. And so as measures are lifted, there are going to be economic hardships. The economies are not the same that they were in January. And so, in many of the countries in the hemisphere, you're going to see a dual effect. So you have, I think, 4 or 5 of the top 10 countries worldwide that receive remittances, money sent from the United States to individuals in countries in our hemisphere. 4 or 5 of the top 10 are in this hemisphere. So whether it's Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, and so those individuals who were employed in the United States in the service sector, the tourism sector, the restaurant sector, some of the hardest hit in the United States, the remittances have been reduced in some cases by 50% going to the countries. And then those individuals receiving remittances, in many cases women, have also lost their job. And so you've stopped getting remittances, and then you've had impact on your own job. And so it's going to be a very complicated moment for this hemisphere. And one of the key things that all citizens, but particularly I have confidence in the role that women play, is ensuring democracy holds. And why does that matter? At the end of the day, you have to invest in the institutions and the institutionality of a country. And so that's in the separation of powers. between a president, the legislative assembly, the judiciary, women play a critical role in ensuring democracy. And as this plays out, as the economy, we all try to recover, transition, get jobs back, get things online, it is women who in many cases are the most resilient, but it will be a challenge. And to the previous panel who, was discussing the impact of quarantine on domestic violence, there's no doubt that that women have in some ways borne the brunt in many ways of quarantine, and will continue to do so in large part because of the types of jobs that women occupy, a significant percentage in the informal sector, and then due to the compounding issue of the reduced remittances.
No doubt, there was an article in the newspapers a few weeks ago about how in this situation that we're all living in, it's pretty much always the case that the woman is the last one who has access to the computer and those kind of things. There's a very interesting question that goes back to making the invisible visible. And it's a question as, would you say that these changes broadens the agenda? In other words, does security from a women's perspective look different than from a man's perspective?
In some ways, it's a very interesting question, and I appreciate that. I think sometimes we do see security slightly different. In some ways, I think, and I don't pretend to speak for all women, but I'll just say from my own view, security for me is always viewed through the eyes of my family. And so, are my kids secure? Can they get to school without having to cross, a different gang territory? Can they get on public transportation? And so in some ways, you're always working, and the first priority is the protection of your family. And that has an impact more broadly how we see security. I'll give you an example of how, one mistake we made early on, and this also talks to the importance of data. So when the security plan was being implemented in El Salvador, there was actually a decision before I got there to collect data on every facet. Why do people feel unsafe? So that's very different than just looking at the homicide rate of a country. Why do people feel unsafe? And so we were collecting data on, do they feel safe at the local park? Is there a place where they can go? Do they go out at night? How do they get from home to work? And we looked at every, probably 100 different criteria. And about 2 years in to the security plan, homicides were down 50%. But yet the feeling by the public had not changed. And so the percentage was still stalled at people felt this high level of insecurity, even though the homicide rate had gone down by half. So I went back to our team and I said, okay, give me the data. And so they came in with this 200-page thing of data. And I went home for the weekend and I'm, sitting on the floor going through the data. And I came through this one chart about public transportation. And when I say public transportation, if you are a woman listening on this call, immediately there are images that come to you, just like there are to me. And that feeling of waiting for a bus in the dark, or the light above the bus stop doesn't work, walking from the bus stop to your home and having, to have mace in your hand or some kind of defensive mechanism, and that feeling of insecurity. And when I looked at the numbers on public transportation, overwhelmingly, women felt insecure in public transportation. So I went back to our team and I said, what are we doing supporting the Salvadoran efforts on public transportation? And the answer was nothing. We had overlooked it. And that was just a big lesson, because as a female leader, as soon as I saw that, of course it made sense we should prioritize security on public transportation, but we missed it. And we were, I go back to my own leadership and I look at who was on our law enforcement team at that moment. No women. So when you look at how do you want to be successful and why it matters to have women at every level, in every group, looking at data, making judgments, because I'm convinced if any woman had been on that team, we would have seen that.
And I agree with you. I'm sorry, I agree with you. I remember once that I was in a meeting at a conference of best practices and at the municipal level. And somebody mentioned that they have turned around people going to the parks because they had changed the lights. And at night, the park was well lit. So women felt safer. And I thought, what a simple solution to something that, sometimes we approach from all of these very complicated public policy, and it's as simple as, making those kind of changes. I want to go to some of the questions that we have here because there are a lot of questions. I want to give as many as possible. There's a specific question about the Jamaica model. It says, can you provide examples of some of the measures taken by the CDS of Jamaica in making women in the military more visible?
So it would be great. You should feature him. So I'm going to give him a shout out. Rocky Mead, if you're listening or your team's listening, I'm giving you a shout out. So some of the things he has done is early on, he made sure that all trainings and seminars, things that prepare women and prepare men to be in leadership positions, that there were at least 25% women in those, each of those trainings and seminars. And I know there's various debates about whether you should put a percentage or not. I do think when you're first trying to make substantive change, it helps to drive to a number. And I say that because I'll bring back my experience from Afghanistan. We were looking at the Fulbright Scholarship, which is the most prestigious scholarship that the United States has. And the Fulbright program was very large in Afghanistan. And when I looked at the data, again, going back to the data, we had about, I want to say 5% women Fulbright scholars, so 95% men. So I went back to our team and I said, one of our goals is to get women into senior leader positions, and the Fulbright program is a critical way to do that in terms of raising their education level, getting them viewed as the top academics, top professionals in a country. And they came back and they said, we can't do that because Afghan fathers won't let their Afghan daughters go study in the United States. Okay, that's a general statement. So we need to look at that and we need to see if in fact that doesn't apply to all Afghan fathers. And I'm sure we can work to break down some of those barriers. But in the meantime, what else could we do to get our participation with 50% women? So they went back to the drawing board and we found ways to do it. We did scholarships to the local American University of Afghanistan, where it was feasible for Afghan fathers to let their daughters go because it was in country. They also agreed to let them go to a neighboring country. So we worked out agreement with that American university in that country. And then there was a critical factor that they couldn't go study in the city because there were no dorms. There were no dormitories for women. So when you get back to your point about sometimes we overcomplicate things, when you dig down and you find out that it's actually the fact that there are no dorms, nowhere for these women to sleep, and that is holding them back from being allowed to go to university, we can fix that. And that applies to public security too. So one day I was out at the border and I always made a point to walk up to female police officers, female military officers, and shake their hand and spend a couple minutes with them. Why? It's the power of the position. And so the media follows you wherever you go. The media is going to capture a senior leader engaging with a female officer, a female military personnel. What does that do? The public sees it. the more times the public sees a female military person in a critical role, a female police officer, it starts to change the perception. So I was out at the border looking for a female officer to go shake their hand, make sure we got them visible. Again, going back to making the invisible visible. And I couldn't find any. So I turned to the chief of police and I said, where are all the women police officers? And he said, well, you know, the women don't really want to serve out here. It's hot. And I was like, really? Because I'm pretty sure these women are tough. So went back, and it come to find out there were no women because it was a border that was far away and there was nowhere for them to sleep. So there was no separate barracks at the border for men and women and no separate bathroom for them to shower, right? So here we are in the Capitol, as to your point, making very complex policy decisions. And it comes down to a $10,000 barrack for women to sleep at and a shower and a bathroom that is separate. Sometimes it's not that complicated.
That's a very good story and very, very true. Sometimes, people say, oh, well, there are no women because they don't want to go through this. And that is actually not true. There are pretty, other things behind that, as you say. I'm trying to summarize some of the questions that are here that have to do with what I would call kind of values and how to perceive women in the military. And sometimes in many regions of the world, you will hear this comment, well, all of these policies to support women or to make it more inclusive to women, in a way are kind of, supporting those who are not as qualified. I think there's actually a question here coming in Spanish about, what do we do when women are kind of taking advantage of the system? How do we fight that stereotype? Because I believe it's a stereotype. I think women who go into the armed forces or the police, they are as committed to service as any other person. So how do we fight that perception? How do we fight that sometimes that kind of speech about the role of women in the armed forces, in the military, or in the police?
Yeah, I think it's a good point and something I think we fight against not only in women in security, but women in any senior level positions. There are standards and there are performance standards. And going back to the Jamaica example, they're very specific on what the standards are, and they don't make exceptions. Now, that means that you also have to look at, are there standards that you're setting up that a woman could not meet just because of biological differences or some kind of difference? And you have to look at that. Is that mission essential? Because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get people in who are the best performers. And so I often go back and think, okay, when you look at a society, if I'm the chief of police and I want to be successful and I want to recruit the best people, if I take women off the table, then I've already taken 50% of the qualified human resources of my country off the table. And so I think it's clear you have to have standards. They have to be transparent. People have to meet them. I think that's why, Jamaica was so proud to tell me that, their top 5 graduates in their school the last go around were women, including in marksmanship and other fields. And he also told me an interesting thing. And one of the chiefs of defense from the Caribbean, because we were talking about this over lunch. So this is the power of the position. We had all of the chiefs of defense for the Caribbean, and we had a women, peace, and security session. And it was right before lunch. So we had this session, we featured chiefs of defense who were being forward-leaning, using their resources, integrating women, making gains on security. And we headed into lunch. And that was the topic of the conversation the whole lunch. And so one of the chiefs of defense from the Caribbean, he said, my average dropout rate for basic training is about 15% overall. When you bring people in, they go to basic training. Some of them fall out, they don't complete it. And he goes, you want to know what that number is for women, the dropout rate? 0. And he said, the women want to be there, they're committed, and they're going to fight like hell to stay in.
That's a very good way of answering it. I agree with you. I think that, performance is important, and sometimes those kind of arguments are counter, with the facts that the women struggle, and they put as much effort, if not more, than other people. Going back to data and how to collect data, there is a very good question here that says, considering military, police, and prosecutor offices are separate institutions, is it possible to measure in which of them women have made, one, the most progress in terms of percentage of the workforce and in achieving senior rank?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think you've hit on exactly the data that we need and don't have for the vast majority of things. So when we look at where we're going for U.S. Southern Command, that is a priority, collecting the data, working with our partner nations, because back to an original point, is that you cannot measure success if you don't have a baseline and know where you're starting and where you want to go. And then also know where you want to target. Again, if you have the data, you can identify where are the gaps, where are you making progress, where are you not. Without the data, it becomes very subjective and very just focused on anecdotes and opinions. So I'm a big believer in getting the data, and even if it takes additional resources, I believe it's important, and it helps us make smart decisions.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question that is being posed about the empowering of women, and the question is more related to the Venezuela-Colombia border and the situation of women in the region, and how their kids and daughters are going through difficult times like kidnapping. But I think the broader question is, how do we contribute to empower women? What can we do to empower women, and what kind of work are you doing from Southcom, or is the U.S. government doing from Department of State or Department of Defense to promote the empowerment of women, both in the U.S. and in the region?
So on that, again, there are structural changes that all of us need to make, the United States, countries in the region, and everybody is in a different path. From U.S. Southern Command, we do have now an office that is entirely focused on women, peace, and security. So a fundamental principle is meeting countries where they are. So, every country is in a different spot. And so we try to meet them where they are and move them up. It's not about, shaming people to then embarrass them. It's about approaching people, understanding where they're at, and then trying to get us all up. Because if we all get up in terms of the United States and the region, we will have more security. And so how do we lift women up? I think, again, you go for the structure, but then you go for the individual. So creating that network, highlighting women, showcasing their talent. I will tell you, the other day, I highlighted a woman from Uruguay who is the first woman to be a head of one of their units, and I published it on Twitter. And within 15 minutes, the head of public affairs from Uruguay messaged me on Twitter, and he said, "Hey, I see that you highlighted, our first female to head this kind of unit. We have more." And so in some ways, and then another country, messaged me and said, can you highlight our woman, this woman who just made Commodore for the first time in our country, this woman who's heading a unit in Colombia. And so in some ways it starts to be a little competitive, which, I'm a big believer in competition. So, showcasing, hey, there are talented women all around. Again, making the invisible visible. People just may not recognize it. And so the more you start to tell those stories, the more you start to show that there are women doing incredible things across this hemisphere, both in the United States and in countries around our area of responsibility, you start to create in some ways a movement of this is normal. So then, in my mind, I look at, boy, I'm looking forward to the day where I don't have to tweet, or I'm not tweeting that this is the first woman to do X. Because once it gets to the third woman, the fourth woman, the 10th woman, then it's just routine. It's not remarkable. And so in some ways, I would love for it not to be remarkable when a woman makes a significant achievement in the security realm, but we're not there yet.
That is very, very important. A very, very good point. You know, I'm old enough to remember when I was a child and I was getting on a plane and I saw a pilot that was a woman. And the first reaction was like, oh my God, women can be pilots. You know, and nowadays, I don't think anybody really pays attention to that. So it's a very good point. Maybe I would like to talk in the few minutes that we have left a little bit more about how do we get the message out? How do we make sure that we are all on board because sometimes when we talk about this, you know, we're preaching to the choir. We know who we're talking about, but how do we get others involved? How do we make sure that those messages are out and that people take ownership of this mission and that we all work towards those goals?
I think that's an important point because, you know, when I arrived to U.S. Southern Command and Admiral Fowler first said, look, I want this to be visible. I want it to be all throughout everything we do. We looked back at what we had been doing and there had been an annual conference. And so all of the resources that we got for this program were put into an annual conference that brought women together, which is important because I think we all share and learn from each other. But to your point, in some ways, it's like we have the phrase preaching to the converted, you know, telling those who already believe what we, you know, that we share. So then we started looking at it differently. So when we had, as I mentioned, the ministers from the Caribbean into U.S. Southern Command for an annual conference, all the chiefs of defense for the Caribbean, we had a women, peace, and security component to that conference where almost the entire audience is male. In fact, I don't think there's a single chief of defense in the Caribbean that is female. And so you're walking into a very different audience, and I can tell you because I was there. So you definitely feel like, okay, this is a skeptical audience who is already looking down the agenda, you know, wanting to know when lunch is. And, you know, how do you convince them that this is A, important, and B, they should do something about it? And I think that's where you come in with validators. So, you know, while women, we have validating stories that are valuable, most of the chiefs of defense are convinced by their peers. So if there are no women peers, who is going to bring it up? And that's why it was so important and is so important to have allies, you know, like Rocky Mead in Jamaica, to tell how he is leading and how his leadership is making Jamaica more secure. And so I think the more you can get the conversation into those environments that are not directed to people who already recognize how valuable, critical, important, essential it is, the more progress that we'll make. So it is about, you know, really getting it into those venues, getting the topic relevant in a way that a neighboring police chief, a neighboring chief of defense will look to his right and say, wow, this is just another best practice. And maybe I should look at how to do that.
That's great. I think you know, collaboration and coordination, it's very, very important when we're talking about these issues. I feel like we just started and we actually just ran out of time. So I think we're going to have to bring you back. It's been wonderful to have you to join us. And I think we have touched upon many, many different issues. I apologize for the questions that we were not able to answer. I think we have done the best we could to address most of the issues, at least in a generic way. I really appreciate your time. I want to thank you on behalf of FIU, LAC, and the Gordon Institute for joining us and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about these issues with our colleagues from Latin America. I want to thank the audience, todos los amigos en América Latina. Muchas gracias. Muchas obrigada. Thank you very much. And Randy, back to you now.
Thank you, Cristina, and thank you for your leadership at the Gordon Institute. I see it on a day-to-day basis, so it's always a pleasure working with you. And Ambassador Maines, thank you again for your leadership on behalf of FIU. So for all those in attendance, thank you very much, especially those. I know there was quite a few from El Salvador coming to see your old ambassador. Very happy to have you on there. I encourage you to, again, follow us on social media, at Gordon Institute, at FIU LAC, with the hashtag HSC2020. I also encourage you to go and look at a lot of the reports that we've helped put together in partnership with Southcom as part of the J2 Analytic Outreach efforts. So our Latin America 2030 reports, as I mentioned, a Venezuela migration report that came out recently with Paula Tufro, who is our moderator at our last session. She co-authored that with OAS's Batilde Munoz. I encourage you to look at those reports at gordoninstitute.fiu.edu and lac.fiu.edu. So tomorrow we'll be back at 11 a.m. We're looking at global pandemics and their effect on the security situation in the hemisphere. That is also being led by one of our female leaders at FIU, Dr. Eileen Marty. So I hope to see you then. Thank you again for all your support and look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Thank you.